Dr. Sarah Martinez had always believed that healing hands were meant to save lives, not take them. Standing in the emergency room of Walter Reed Medical Center at 3 in the morning, she worked frantically to save the life of a young soldier who had been brought in from overseas. Blood covered her scrubs as she pressed her hands against the massive wound in his chest, trying to stop the bleeding that threatened to steal away another young life. "Come on, stay with me," she whispered to the unconscious Marine whose dog tags read, Rodriguez Miguel, 19. He was barely older than her youngest brother. The monitors beeped frantically as his vital signs weakened. Sarah had been working for 18 hours straight, but she refused to give up. This was her calling, her purpose in life, to stand between death and the brave men and women who served their country. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Texas, where her father worked as a mechanic and her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. From a young age, she knew she wanted to be a doctor. While other kids played with toys, Sarah bandaged her dolls and pretended to perform surgery on her stuffed animals. Her parents worked double shifts to save money for her education, believing in their daughter's dream even when it seemed impossible. Medical school had been the hardest thing she had ever done. While her classmates came from wealthy families and had every advantage, Sarah worked part-time jobs to pay for books and food. She studied in the hospital cafeteria during her breaks from cleaning rooms, determined to prove that a poor girl from Texas could become a doctor. Her professors often found her sleeping in the library, having studied until she collapsed from exhaustion. After graduating at the top of her class, Sarah chose to specialize in trauma surgery. She wanted to work where she could make the biggest difference, where her skills could mean the difference between life and death. When the opportunity came to work with military personnel, she jumped at the chance. These were heroes who had sacrificed everything for their country, and she wanted to give something back. The emergency room at Walter Reed was unlike anything she had experienced before. Every day brought new challenges, new cases that tested her skills and her resolve. She treated soldiers who had lost limbs to roadside bombs, Marines who had been shot by snipers, and sailors who had been injured in training accidents. Each case was personal to her. Each patient was someone's son or daughter, husband or wife. Young Rodriguez was fighting for his life, and Sarah was fighting right alongside him. She had seen too many young soldiers die on her operating table, and each loss felt like a personal failure. Her colleagues often told her that she cared too much, that she needed to maintain professional distance to survive in this job. But Sarah couldn't turn off her emotions. Every patient mattered to her. "Dr. Martinez," called out Nurse Patterson, "we're losing him." The monitors showed Rodriguez's blood pressure dropping dangerously low. Sarah looked at the young man's face, peaceful despite the chaos around him. She thought about his family back home, probably sleeping peacefully, unaware that their son was fighting for his life thousands of miles away. "Not today," Sarah said firmly. "Get me 2 units of O-negative blood and prep the OR. We're going to save this kid." Her hands moved with practiced precision as she worked to stabilize Rodriguez. This was what she lived for, these moments when her training and determination could cheat death. After 4 hours of surgery, Rodriguez was stable. Sarah sat in the break room, finally allowing herself a moment to breathe. Her hands shook slightly as she held her coffee cup, the adrenaline slowly wearing off. She thought about the letter she would write to Rodriguez's parents, letting them know their son was alive and would recover fully. Dr. James Harrison, the chief of surgery, found her there an hour later. "Sarah, you saved another one," he said with admiration. "That kid owes his life to you." Sarah smiled tiredly. This was why she became a doctor. This was her purpose, but Harrison's expression grew serious. "I need to talk to you about something else. There's an opportunity that's come up, something that could change your career." He sat down across from her, his voice lowering. "The Navy SEALs are looking for a doctor to join their medical team. They need someone with your skills, someone who can work under pressure in hostile environments." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "SEALs, but I'm not military. I'm just a doctor." Harrison shook his head. "You're not just anything, Sarah. You're one of the best trauma surgeons in the country. The military has taken notice of your work here. They want to offer you a position as a civilian contractor, working directly with SEAL teams in the field." The idea seemed impossible. Sarah had never considered leaving the hospital, leaving the controlled environment where she could focus entirely on healing. "I don't know anything about the military world," she said. Harrison smiled. You know about saving lives under pressure. That's exactly what they need. As Sarah walked home that morning watching the sunrise over Washington, D.C., she thought about Harrison's offer. Working with the SEALs would mean leaving everything she knew behind. It would mean going into dangerous situations, far from the safety of the hospital. But it would also mean being there when soldiers needed her most, in the field where her skills could prevent injuries from becoming fatal. She thought about Rodriguez and all the other young soldiers she had treated. Many of them had been injured in situations where immediate medical care could have made the difference between life and death. If she could be there in those crucial first moments, how many lives could she save? That evening, Sarah called her parents to tell them about the offer. Her mother worried about the danger, but her father understood. "Mija," he said in his gentle voice, "you've always followed your heart. If your heart is telling you to help these soldiers, then that's what you should do." Sarah knew he was right. Her heart was telling her to take the leap, to expand her mission of saving lives beyond the walls of the hospital. The next morning, Sarah knocked on Harrison's office door. "I'll do it," she said simply. "I'll join the SEALs medical team." Harrison smiled broadly. "I knew you would. They're going to train you for 6 months before your first deployment. Sarah, you're about to embark on the adventure of a lifetime." As Sarah began preparing for this new chapter in her life, she had no idea how dramatically it would change her. She thought she was simply expanding her ability to save lives. She had no way of knowing that within a year, those same healing hands would be holding a different kind of tool entirely. The first day of SEAL medical training nearly broke Sarah's spirit. Standing on the beach at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado at 5 in the morning, she watched the sun rise over the Pacific Ocean while trying to catch her breath. Her body ached from the physical training that had started before dawn, and she questioned whether she had made the right decision. "Doc, you still with us?" called out Chief Petty Officer Mike Stevens, the gruff instructor who had been pushing her limits for the past week. Stevens was a 20-year veteran with scars covering his arms and a permanently stern expression. He had made it clear from day one that he didn't think a civilian doctor belonged in SEAL training. Sarah nodded, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Yes, Chief, still here." She had learned quickly that complaining or showing weakness would only make things harder. The SEALs respected toughness and determination above all else, qualities she was discovering she possessed in greater measure than she had ever imagined. The training was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in medical school. Instead of studying anatomy in quiet libraries, she was learning to perform surgery in simulated combat conditions. Instructors would set off explosions nearby while she worked on training dummies, testing her ability to concentrate under extreme stress. They made her crawl through mud while carrying medical supplies, and forced her to make life or death decisions in seconds rather than minutes. In the field, you won't have the luxury of a sterile operating room, explained Lieutenant Commander Patricia Walsh, the only other woman in the training program. Walsh was a Navy doctor who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen real combat. "You'll be working in the dirt, under fire, with limited supplies. Every second counts." Sarah found herself forming an unlikely friendship with Walsh, who became both mentor and confidant during the grueling training process. Walsh understood the unique challenges of being a woman in the male-dominated world of special operations, and she helped Sarah navigate the complex dynamics of earning respect from the SEALs. "They're testing you," Walsh explained one evening as they sat in the mess hall after a particularly brutal day of training. "Every exercise, every challenge, they want to know if you'll break under pressure. They need to know that when bullets start flying, you'll still be able to do your job." The training scenarios became increasingly realistic and intense. Sarah learned to treat gunshot wounds while lying flat on her stomach to avoid simulated sniper fire. She practiced emergency amputations in complete darkness using only a small flashlight. Most challenging of all, she learned to make the terrible decisions that combat medics sometimes faced. Who to treat first when multiple soldiers were wounded and time was running out. During one particularly difficult exercise, Sarah was presented with 3 wounded patients, actually SEALs covered in fake blood and makeup to simulate various injuries. She had to decide quickly which one to treat first, knowing that her choice would determine who lived and who died in the scenario. The first patient had a severe head injury, but was conscious and talking. The second had massive bleeding from a leg wound but strong vital signs. The third was unconscious with breathing problems. Sarah's medical training told her to start with the breathing problems, but her heart wanted to help the conscious patient who was asking for help. "Doc, who are you going to save?" Stevens asked coldly, watching her hesitate. "In real combat, hesitation kills people. Make your choice." Sarah took a deep breath and went to the patient with breathing problems, knowing she was making the right medical decision even though it felt wrong emotionally. After the exercise, Stevens pulled her aside. "Good choice, Doc. You chose with your brain instead of your heart. That's what keeps people alive out there." It was the first compliment he had given her, and Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness. She was learning to make decisions that went against every instinct she had developed as a healer. The physical training was just as demanding as the medical scenarios. Sarah learned to rappel from helicopters, swim in rough ocean conditions, and navigate using only a compass and map. Her soft doctor's hands became calloused from rope climbing and weapon handling. Yes, weapon handling, another shock to her system. Every member of a SEAL team needs to be able to defend themselves and their teammates, explained Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, coincidentally sharing a name with the young Marine she had saved. "You can't save lives if you're dead, Doc." Rodriguez was a patient instructor who helped Sarah overcome her initial fear and reluctance around firearms. Sarah had never held a gun before joining the program. The weight of the weapon felt strange and wrong in her hands, which had been trained to heal rather than harm. But she gradually learned to appreciate the precision and discipline required for marksmanship. It was, she realized, not unlike surgery. Both required steady hands, controlled breathing, and absolute focus. "You're a natural shot," Rodriguez told her after a particularly good day at the range. "Your surgical training gives you an advantage. You're used to making precise movements under pressure." Sarah found herself oddly proud of this compliment, even though part of her felt guilty about becoming skilled with weapons. The most challenging part of training wasn't physical. It was psychological. Sarah had to learn to think like a soldier while maintaining her identity as a doctor. She practiced giving orders and making tactical decisions, skills that felt foreign to someone trained to collaborate with colleagues rather than command subordinates. "Leadership in combat is different from leadership in a hospital," Walsh explained during one of their evening talks. "Out there, you might be the senior medical officer for an entire operation. SEALs will look to you for decisions about medical evacuations, treatment priorities, and risk assessments. You need to be ready for that responsibility." As the weeks passed, Sarah noticed changes in herself that went beyond improved physical fitness. She walked with more confidence, spoke with greater authority, and found herself thinking strategically about problems rather than just medically. The other trainees began treating her as an equal rather than an outsider, and she felt herself becoming part of the team. The final exercise of training was a 3-day field operation that would test everything she had learned. Sarah and a team of SEALs were dropped in a remote desert location with minimal supplies and told to complete a series of medical and tactical objectives while avoiding enemy forces played by other military units. On the second night, everything went wrong. During a simulated rescue operation, Sarah's team was ambushed, and 2 SEALs were designated as seriously wounded. Working by moonlight with only basic supplies, Sarah had to stabilize both patients while the team was under simulated fire and preparing to move to an extraction point. Her hands shook as she worked on the first patient, exhaustion and stress making every movement difficult. But her training kicked in, and she found herself moving with the same precision she had always shown in the operating room. She stabilized both patients and helped coordinate their evacuation to safety. After the exercise ended, Stevens approached her with what might have been a smile on his weathered face. "Doc, you did good out there, real good. I think you're ready for the teams." Coming from Stevens, this was the highest praise possible. On graduation day, Sarah stood with pride as she received her certification as a SEAL team medical officer. Her parents had flown in from Texas, their faces beaming with pride and worry in equal measure. Sarah looked different than she had 6 months earlier. Stronger, more confident, but also somehow harder around the edges. "I'm proud of you, Mija," her father said, embracing her after the ceremony. "But promise me you'll be careful out there." Sarah hugged him back, knowing that she couldn't make that promise. She was about to enter a world where being careful might mean letting someone else die. As Sarah prepared for her first deployment, she reflected on how much she had changed. She was still a doctor, still committed to saving lives, but now she was also a warrior trained to operate in the most dangerous places on Earth. She had no idea that this transformation was only the beginning, or that the skills she was learning would soon be tested in ways she never imagined. The helicopter blades chopped through the thick night air as Sarah sat strapped into her seat, trying to calm her racing heart. This was it, her first real mission with SEAL Team 7. Below them, the mountains of Afghanistan stretched endlessly in the darkness, hiding dangers she could only imagine. Her medical kit felt heavier than usual, weighted down with the knowledge that tonight lives would depend on her skills. 5 minutes out, Doc, shouted Lieutenant Jake Morrison over the engine noise. Morrison was the team leader, a 32-year-old from Ohio who had earned the respect of his men through 4 previous deployments. His calm demeanor had helped Sarah feel more confident during their weeks of pre-deployment training together. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Her medical supplies were organized perfectly, each item in its designated place so she could find anything by touch alone in complete darkness. Her weapon, a compact rifle she had trained with extensively, was secure but easily accessible. The transformation from hospital doctor to combat medic still felt surreal, but her training had prepared her for this moment. The mission was supposed to be straightforward, a rescue operation to extract a captured intelligence officer from a Taliban compound in a remote valley. Intelligence reports suggested minimal resistance, with most enemy fighters having moved to different locations. Sarah's job was to provide medical support and treat any injuries sustained during the extraction. Remember, Doc, Morrison had briefed her earlier, your primary job is keeping our guys healthy and ready to fight. But if that intel officer is wounded, he becomes your priority. He's got information that could save hundreds of American lives. Sarah had nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. As the helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust, Sarah felt her training take over. All the nervousness and uncertainty faded away, replaced by focused determination. She moved with the team through the darkness, her night vision goggles turning the world into shades of green and black. The compound was smaller than expected, a collection of mud brick buildings surrounded by a low wall. The SEALs moved like shadows, their years of experience evident in every step. Sarah stayed close to Morrison, exactly as they had practiced, ready to respond to any medical emergency. The first sign that something was wrong came when Petty Officer Danny Chen, the team's communications specialist, couldn't raise their backup helicopter on the radio. "Comms are down," he whispered into his headset. Morrison frowned but gave the signal to continue. They had come too far to turn back now. As they approached the main building, Sarah heard Morrison's sharp intake of breath through the radio. "Multiple heat signatures," he reported, studying the thermal imaging on his scope. "This place isn't as empty as intel suggested." The rescue was about to become significantly more complicated. The team moved into position around the building, preparing for what was now clearly going to be a firefight. Sarah positioned herself behind cover where she could see the entire team, but remain protected from enemy fire. Her heart pounded as she realized this was no longer a training exercise. People were about to be shooting real bullets with the intent to kill. When the shooting started, it was louder and more chaotic than any simulation. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as Taliban fighters poured out of hidden positions throughout the compound. Sarah watched in fascination and terror as the SEALs responded with the precision and lethality they were famous for, their movements coordinated despite the chaos around them. "Doc, we need you." The call came from Petty Officer Mike Santos, who was crouched behind a low wall about 30 yards from Sarah's position. She could see someone lying motionless beside him. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her medical kit and sprinted across the open ground, bullets whining past her head. The wounded SEAL was Petty Officer First Class Tom Bradley, a quiet man from Montana who had shown Sarah pictures of his newborn daughter during their pre-deployment training. A bullet had caught him in the shoulder, and blood was spreading across his uniform. Sarah immediately went to work, her hands steady despite the gunfire around them. "How bad is it, Doc?" Bradley asked through gritted teeth. Sarah quickly assessed the wound while applying pressure to stop the bleeding. The bullet had missed major arteries and bone, but Bradley was losing blood fast and would need surgery to prevent infection. "You're going to be fine," Sarah told him, injecting him with morphine for the pain. "But you're done fighting for tonight." She worked quickly to bandage the wound and get Bradley stabilized. Around them, the firefight continued to rage. But Sarah found herself completely focused on her patient, just as she had been in countless hospital emergencies. "Doc, we've got the package, but we need to move now." Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece. The team had successfully rescued the intelligence officer, but Taliban reinforcements were approaching from multiple directions. They needed to reach the extraction point immediately. Supporting Bradley between herself and Santos, Sarah helped move the wounded SEAL toward their planned exit route. The intelligence officer, a young CIA analyst named David Kumar, was conscious but weak from days of captivity and interrogation. Sarah quickly checked him for serious injuries while the team provided covering fire. "Can you walk?" she asked Kumar. He nodded weakly and Sarah helped him to his feet. Now she was responsible for keeping 2 men alive while under enemy fire, a scenario she had trained for but hoped never to face. The withdrawal from the compound was a running battle through the mountains. Sarah found herself firing her weapon for the first time in combat, something that would have been unthinkable to her just a year earlier. But when Taliban fighters appeared in their path, threatening the wounded men she was protecting, she didn't hesitate to defend them. "Good shooting, Doc," shouted Sergeant Paul Williams as Sarah's precise shots forced 2 enemy fighters to take cover, allowing the team to continue their escape. Sarah felt a confusing mix of pride and horror at her accuracy with the rifle. Her surgical training had indeed made her a natural marksman, but using those skills to wound rather than heal felt like a betrayal of everything she had once believed about herself. The extraction helicopter finally appeared as dawn was breaking over the mountains, its rotors providing the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. As they loaded Bradley and Kumar aboard, Sarah performed one final check of their vital signs. Both men would survive, thanks partly to her quick medical intervention. During the flight back to base, Sarah sat quietly, processing what had just happened. She had saved 2 lives tonight, fulfilling her mission as the team medic, but she had also shot at enemy fighters, crossing a line she had never imagined crossing when she first decided to become a doctor. "You did good tonight, Doc," Morrison told her as they landed at the forward operating base. "Bradley owes his life to you, and that intel officer has information that's going to save a lot of American soldiers." Sarah nodded, knowing he was right but still struggling with the contradictions of her new role. In her small room at the base that night, Sarah wrote in the journal she had started keeping during training. "Today I saved 2 lives," she wrote, "but I also tried to take others. I'm not sure who I'm becoming, but I know I can't go back to who I was." Over the following weeks, Sarah participated in dozens of similar missions. Each one reinforced the same lesson. In this world, saving lives sometimes required taking them. She became known throughout the special operations community as one of the best combat medics in the field, someone who could keep fighting men alive under the worst possible conditions. But with each mission, Sarah felt herself changing in ways that both impressed and worried her. She was becoming harder, more comfortable with violence, less shocked by the brutalities of war. The gentle doctor from Texas was still there, but she was being shaped by forces that demanded she become something else entirely. The other SEALs began to treat her not just as their medic, but as a full member of the team. They trusted her with their lives, and she had proven worthy of that trust. But Sarah was beginning to realize that earning that trust had required her to become someone she didn't entirely recognize. As she prepared for what would be her most challenging mission yet, Sarah had no way of knowing that the skills she was developing, both medical and combat, would soon be tested in a situation that would change everything she thought she knew about herself and her purpose in the world. The village of Karibag looked peaceful in the early morning light, nestled in a valley between towering mountains like something from a postcard. Sarah crouched behind a rocky outcrop with SEAL Team 7, watching the small collection of mud brick houses through her binoculars. Smoke rose lazily from cooking fires, and she could see children playing in the dusty streets. It was hard to believe that somewhere in this innocent-looking place was one of the most wanted terrorists in Afghanistan. "Intel says Mahmoud Hassan is holed up in the 3rd house from the left," Morrison whispered, pointing to a slightly larger building with a red door. Hassan was responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed over 200 coalition soldiers in the past year. Today's mission was to capture him alive for interrogation, but everyone knew that was unlikely to happen. Sarah checked her medical supplies one more time, a routine that had become second nature after 6 months of combat operations. She had treated everything from bullet wounds to shrapnel injuries to heat exhaustion during her deployment. Her hands, once soft from hospital work, were now calloused and scarred from climbing rocks and handling weapons in harsh conditions. "Remember, we want Hassan alive if possible," Morrison briefed the team. "But protecting civilian lives is the priority. Doc, you stay close to me. If we encounter wounded civilians, they become your responsibility before any of our guys." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of that order. In her months with the SEALs, she had learned that protecting innocent people was always the most important mission. The team moved down into the village as the sun climbed higher, their weapons ready, but pointed down to avoid frightening the villagers. Sarah watched the faces of the people they passed, mostly women and elderly men, since the younger men were either working in distant fields or had been recruited by various fighting groups. The children stared at the strange soldiers with curious eyes, and Sarah found herself smiling at a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Everything went wrong in seconds. The explosion came from a house they had already passed, a massive blast that threw Sarah to the ground and filled the air with dust and debris. As her ears stopped ringing, she heard Morrison shouting orders and the distinctive crack of rifle fire from multiple directions. They had walked into a carefully planned ambush. "ID, IED," screamed Petty Officer Chen, rolling behind cover as bullets whistled overhead. The innocent-looking village had transformed into a war zone in the space of a heartbeat. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from windows and rooftops as dozens of hidden fighters opened fire on the SEAL team. "Doc, casualties." Santos called out from across the street where 2 SEALs had been caught in the open when the shooting started. Sarah could see Petty Officer Rodriguez lying motionless in the dust, blood spreading beneath his body. Without thinking, she grabbed her medical kit and sprinted toward him, ignoring the bullets that kicked up dirt around her feet. Rodriguez was unconscious and bleeding heavily from a head wound. Sarah worked frantically to stop the bleeding while Santos provided covering fire above her. The sound of gunfire was deafening, and she could hear Morrison on the radio calling for immediate extraction and air support. "How is he?" Santos asked, his voice tight with concern. Rodriguez was a popular team member, a joker who kept everyone's spirits up during difficult missions. Sarah checked his pulse and breathing while continuing to work on the head wound. "He's alive, but we need to get him out of here fast," she replied, applying pressure to the wound. The bullet had grazed his skull, causing massive bleeding but missing his brain by inches. Rodriguez was lucky to be alive, but he needed immediate surgery to survive. As Sarah worked on Rodriguez, she became aware of another sound mixed in with the gunfire: children crying. Looking around, she saw that several civilians had been caught in the crossfire. An elderly man lay crumpled against a wall, and she could see a woman holding a small child who appeared to be injured. "Santos, can you help me move Rodriguez to cover?" Sarah asked. Together, they dragged the unconscious SEAL behind a low wall where he would be protected from the worst of the gunfire. Sarah quickly bandaged his head wound and injected him with morphine before turning her attention to the civilians. The woman was holding a little boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. The child had been hit by shrapnel and was bleeding from his leg and arm. His mother was speaking rapidly in Pashto, the local language, begging Sarah to help her son. Even without understanding the words, Sarah could hear the desperation in the woman's voice. "I'm going to help him," Sarah told the woman, hoping her tone would convey what her words could not. She began working on the child's wounds, noting that while they looked bad, they weren't life-threatening if treated properly. The boy was conscious and crying, which was actually a good sign. As Sarah treated the wounded child, she heard Morrison's voice over the radio. "Air support is 5 minutes out. We need to mark the target buildings and get ready for strikes." Sarah looked up from her patient, suddenly understanding what was about to happen. "Morrison, there are civilians in those buildings," she called out over the gunfire. "We need to evacuate them before any airstrikes." Morrison's response was immediate and harsh. "Negative, Doc, we don't have time. Those buildings are full of hostiles, and we're taking heavy casualties. The strikes are going ahead as planned." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized what this meant. The airstrikes would destroy the buildings where the enemy fighters were positioned, but they would also kill any civilians who might be trapped inside. The next few minutes passed in a blur of violence and impossible decisions. Sarah finished treating the wounded child and helped his mother carry him to safety. She then returned to Rodriguez, who was beginning to regain consciousness but was still in critical condition. Around her, the SEALs continued to fight desperately against overwhelming odds. The sound of approaching aircraft filled the air, and Sarah watched in horror as missiles streaked down from the sky. The buildings that had been full of enemy fighters disappeared in massive explosions, sending debris flying in all directions. The gunfire stopped almost immediately, along with any screams or cries that might have been coming from inside those buildings. Targets destroyed, Morrison reported grimly. Begin withdrawal to extraction point. As the team began moving through the village, Sarah saw the results of the airstrikes. The buildings were completely destroyed, reduced to piles of rubble and twisted metal. She tried not to think about who might have been inside. At the extraction point, Sarah worked frantically to stabilize Rodriguez for the helicopter flight back to base. He was conscious now, but confused and in significant pain. The head wound had stopped bleeding, but he would need immediate surgery when they reached the field hospital. "You saved my life, Doc," Rodriguez whispered as Sarah checked his vital signs. "I owe you everything." Sarah squeezed his hand, trying to smile despite the sick feeling in her stomach. She had saved Rodriguez's life, but what about the people in those buildings? Had she failed to save them, or had there been no way to save them at all? During the flight back to base, Sarah stared out the helicopter window at the destroyed village below. She had joined the SEALs to save lives, but today felt different from her previous missions. Today she felt like she had been forced to choose between saving American soldiers and saving Afghan civilians, and she wasn't sure she had made the right choice. "Good work today, Doc," Morrison told her as they landed. "Rodriguez is alive because of you, and we eliminated a major terrorist cell. Mission accomplished." Sarah nodded, but couldn't bring herself to feel the satisfaction that usually came with a successful operation. That night, Sarah sat in her small room and tried to write in her journal, but the words wouldn't come. How could she describe what had happened? How could she explain the feeling that something fundamental had changed inside her during those few minutes of chaos and violence? For the first time since joining the SEALs, Sarah began to question whether she was still the same person who had wanted to become a doctor to save lives. The line between protecting the innocent and participating in their destruction had become blurred in ways she had never imagined possible. As she finally fell asleep, Sarah didn't know that the events in Karabagh were only the beginning. The choices she had been forced to make today would pale in comparison to what was coming. And the gentle doctor from Texas was about to discover just how far she was willing to go to protect the people she had sworn to serve. The intelligence briefing room at Forward Operating Base Chapman was packed with tension as Sarah sat with SEAL Team 7, studying satellite images of their next target. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at Karabagh, and Sarah was still struggling with nightmares about the destroyed buildings and the families who might have been inside them. But tonight's mission was different. Tonight, they finally had a chance to capture Mahmoud Hassan alive. "Our source inside Hassan's organization confirms he'll be at this compound tomorrow night," explained Major Patricia Collins, the intelligence officer running the briefing. Collins was a sharp woman in her 40s, who had spent years tracking high-value targets across Afghanistan. "This is our best shot at getting him, but the window is narrow. He's only staying for one night before moving to a new location." Sarah studied the photographs of the compound, noting the layout and potential escape routes. After months of combat operations, she had learned to think tactically as well as medically. The compound was larger than most they had targeted, with multiple buildings and what appeared to be a small medical clinic attached to the main structure. "Intel suggests Hassan may have wounded fighters with him," Collins continued. "Our source reports that several of his men were injured in a coalition airstrike last week, and they're receiving medical treatment at the compound. This could work to our advantage. Wounded men can't fight as effectively." Morrison raised his hand. "What about civilian presence? Are we looking at another Karabagh situation?" Sarah felt her stomach tighten at the mention of their previous mission. The question of civilian casualties had been weighing heavily on everyone's mind since that day. Collins shook her head. "Intelligence suggests minimal civilian presence. The compound is being used as a temporary safe house and medical facility. Our source believes there are only Hassan, his fighters, and possibly a local doctor treating the wounded." Sarah felt some relief at this news, but she had learned not to trust intelligence reports completely. "Doc, your role in this mission is crucial," Morrison said, turning to Sarah. "If Hassan or any of his men are wounded during the operation, we need them kept alive for interrogation. These guys have information about future attacks that could save hundreds of coalition lives. Sarah nodded, understanding the importance but feeling the familiar conflict between her medical ethics and military objectives. The next evening, Sarah found herself crammed into a helicopter with the team, flying through the darkness toward what everyone hoped would be their most successful mission yet. She had spent the afternoon preparing her medical supplies, organizing everything she might need to treat both American and enemy casualties. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than usual. 10 minutes out, the pilot announced over the intercom. Sarah checked her equipment one final time, noting that in addition to her medical supplies, she was carrying more ammunition than usual. Recent missions had taught her that being prepared for extended firefights was essential for survival. As they approached the target compound, Sarah could see lights in several of the buildings below. The place looked active, which was both good and bad news. Good because it meant Hassan was likely there as reported. Bad because active meant more people, and more people meant more potential casualties. The helicopter touched down in a field about half a mile from the compound, and the team moved through the darkness with practiced precision. Sarah stayed close to Morrison, her night vision goggles turning the world into familiar shades of green. After months of night operations, she had become as comfortable moving in darkness as any of the SEALs. Multiple heat signatures confirmed, reported Petty Officer Williams, studying his thermal imaging scope. Looks like at least 8 people in the main building, plus movement in the medical clinic. Morrison nodded and signaled for the team to take positions around the compound. The plan was simple: surround the compound, call for Hassan's surrender, and be prepared for the inevitable firefight when he refused. Sarah positioned herself where she could see the entire compound while remaining protected from return fire. Her medical training had taught her to always be thinking about where casualties might occur and how to reach them quickly. Hassan, this is the United States Navy. Morrison's amplified voice echoed across the compound in both English and Pashto. You are surrounded. Come out with your hands visible and you will not be harmed. Sarah held her breath, knowing that Hassan had never surrendered before and was unlikely to start now. The response came in the form of automatic weapons fire from multiple windows in the main building. Sarah watched muzzle flashes light up the darkness as Hassan's fighters opened fire on the SEAL positions. The team responded with disciplined, accurate fire, each shot carefully aimed to neutralize threats while preserving the possibility of taking prisoners. Doc, we've got movement in the medical clinic, Santos called out from his position near the smaller building. Looks like someone's trying to escape out the back. Sarah could see a figure moving through the shadows behind the clinic, possibly carrying something or supporting another person. I've got it, Sarah responded, moving to intercept whoever was fleeing the clinic. As she rounded the corner of the building, she came face to face with a man carrying what appeared to be medical supplies. In the green glow of her night vision, she could see he was wearing civilian clothes and appeared to be unarmed. Stop. Hands up, Sarah commanded in Pashto, one of the few phrases she had learned during her deployment. The man froze, dropping the medical bag he was carrying. Sarah could see he was terrified, his hands shaking as he raised them above his head. This was clearly the local Dr. Collins had mentioned, not a fighter. Please, I am doctor, the man said in broken English. I help wounded only. I no fighter. Sarah could see the truth in his eyes. This was another medical professional, someone who had taken the same oath she had taken to do no harm. He was just trying to help people, regardless of which side they were on. Get down on the ground, Sarah ordered, keeping her weapon trained on him while she radioed Morrison. I've got a civilian doctor here. He's not armed. Morrison's response was immediate and harsh. Secure him and continue the mission. We'll sort out civilians after we get Hassan. Sarah looked at the frightened doctor, seeing herself reflected in his situation. How many times had she treated wounded soldiers without asking which side they fought for? As Sarah zip-tied the doctor's hands, she noticed movement from inside the medical clinic. Through a window, she could see several figures lying on cots, the wounded fighters that intelligence had reported. One of them appeared to be trying to reach for a weapon beside his bed. Stay down and you won't be hurt, Sarah told the doctor in Pashto before moving toward the clinic entrance. Inside, she found 3 wounded men, all clearly fighters based on their weapons and equipment. 2 were unconscious or barely conscious, but the third was alert and reaching for an AK-47 rifle. Don't move, Sarah shouted, pointing her weapon at the wounded fighter. The man froze, his eyes meeting hers across the small room. He was young, probably not much older than the soldiers she treated regularly. His leg was bandaged where he had been wounded in the previous airstrike, and she could see pain and fear in his expression. For a moment that felt like eternity, Sarah and the wounded fighter stared at each other. Here was an enemy combatant, someone who had probably been shooting at American soldiers just days before. But he was also a patient, someone who needed medical care to survive. Everything she had ever learned about medical ethics told her to help him. The sound of gunfire from the main building intensified, and Sarah heard Morrison's voice over the radio. "We need Hassan alive. Repeat, Hassan must be taken alive." The pressure to succeed in their mission was enormous, and Sarah knew that these wounded fighters might have information that could help save American lives. The young fighter continued to stare at Sarah, his hand still reaching toward his weapon. She could see the calculation in his eyes. He was trying to decide whether he could reach the rifle before she could stop him. Sarah realized that in the next few seconds, she would have to make a choice that would define who she had become. "Please," the fighter said quietly in English, "let me die with honor." Sarah understood what he was asking. He wanted to die fighting rather than be captured and interrogated. It was a request she never could have imagined hearing when she first became a doctor. The gunfire outside was getting closer, and Sarah could hear the team calling for her assistance with casualties. She needed to make a decision about the wounded fighters immediately. They could be valuable intelligence assets, but they were also human beings in need of medical care. As Sarah looked at the young fighter's face, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Pinned to his vest was a photograph of two small children. His children, she realized. This wasn't just an enemy combatant. This was a father, someone fighting for reasons she couldn't understand but couldn't entirely condemn either. The moment stretched on as Sarah felt the weight of every decision she had made since joining the SEALs. All the training, all the missions, all the moral compromises had led to this instant when she would have to choose between the doctor she had been and the soldier she had become. Outside, the battle for Hassan was reaching its climax. But inside the small medical clinic, a different kind of battle was being fought. One for Sarah's soul and her understanding of who she was meant to be in this complex, violent world. Time seemed frozen as Sarah stared into the eyes of the wounded fighter, her weapon trained on him while his hand inched toward the rifle beside his bed. The photograph of his children seemed to glow in the dim light of the medical clinic, and Sarah found herself thinking about her own family back in Texas. How had she gotten so far from the idealistic young woman who had wanted nothing more than to save lives? The decision came in an instant, driven by instincts that had been shaped by months of combat and moral compromise. As the fighter's fingers touched the grip of his weapon, Sarah squeezed the trigger. The single shot echoed through the small clinic, and the young father slumped back onto his cot, the photograph of his children fluttering to the floor. Sarah stared at what she had done, her hands trembling as the full weight of the moment crashed over her. She had killed a wounded patient, someone who had been under her medical care. The man who had been reaching for his weapon was now motionless, blood spreading across the bandages that the local doctor had carefully applied to his wounds. "Doc, we need you out here." Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece, snapping her back to the immediate crisis. The battle for Hassan was still raging, and her team needed medical support. Sarah looked at the two remaining wounded fighters, both of whom were now staring at her with a mixture of fear and hatred. "Stay still and you'll live," she told them in Pashto, her voice somehow steady despite the chaos in her mind. She quickly checked that they had no weapons within reach before moving toward the clinic exit. As she stepped over the body of the man she had just killed, she tried not to look at the photograph of his children. Outside, the compound was in chaos. The main building was partially destroyed by explosives, and she could see several bodies scattered around the courtyard. Morrison was crouched behind cover, speaking rapidly into his radio while providing covering fire for two SEALs who were attempting to breach the building where Hassan was believed to be hiding. "Casualty," Santos called out from near the main building. Sarah could see Petty Officer Williams lying motionless near a doorway, blood pooling beneath his body. Without hesitation, she sprinted across the open ground, her medical training overriding everything else as she focused on saving her teammate. Williams had taken multiple gunshots to his chest and abdomen, wounds that would have been immediately fatal without body armor. Even with protection, he was in critical condition, struggling to breathe as blood filled his lungs. Sarah worked frantically to stabilize him, inserting a chest tube to relieve the pressure while calling for immediate evacuation. "How bad?" Morrison asked, appearing beside her as she worked. His face was grim, covered in dust and debris from the explosions. The mission was not going according to plan, and Sarah could see the stress wearing on their team leader. "He needs surgery within the hour or he won't make it," Sarah replied, continuing to work on William's wounds. "We need to extract him now." Morrison nodded and called for immediate helicopter support while Sarah prepared Williams for transport. As the medical evacuation helicopter approached, Morrison grabbed Sarah's arm. "We got Hassan, but he's wounded. You need to keep him alive until we can get him back to base for interrogation." Sarah looked toward the main building where 2 SEALs were, carrying an unconscious figure toward their position. Mahmoud Hassan looked smaller than Sarah had expected from the intelligence photographs. He was a thin man in his 50s, with graying hair and a face lined by years of conflict. Blood seeped from a gunshot wound in his shoulder, and Sarah could see that he was unconscious but breathing steadily. "Is he going to survive?" Morrison asked as Sarah quickly examined Hassan's wound. The bullet had passed through his shoulder without hitting major arteries or organs, but he had lost significant blood and needed immediate treatment to prevent shock. "Yes, if we get him medical attention quickly," Sarah replied, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. She found it strange to be working so hard to save the life of someone who had been responsible for killing so many American soldiers, but her medical training took over, and she treated Hassan with the same care she would give any patient. The evacuation helicopter landed in a whirlwind of dust and noise, and Sarah helped load both Williams and Hassan aboard. As they lifted off, she worked on both patients simultaneously, monitoring their vital signs and adjusting their treatment as needed. Williams was stable but critical, while Hassan was conscious now and glaring at her with undisguised hatred. "You are the woman doctor who fights with the Crusaders," Hassan said in surprisingly good English. Sarah looked at him with surprise, not expecting him to speak her language. "I have heard stories about you. They say you save lives with one hand and take them with the other." Sarah didn't respond, focusing instead on checking Hassan's bandages, but his words struck her deeply because they felt uncomfortably accurate. In the space of a single hour, she had killed a wounded patient and saved the life of a terrorist leader. The contradiction felt impossible to reconcile. "The young man you killed in the clinic," Hassan continued, his voice weak but determined. "His name was Omar. He was fighting to feed his children after your bombs destroyed his farm. You killed a father defending his family." Sarah's hand stilled for a moment as she processed what Hassan was telling her. He was reaching for a weapon, Sarah said quietly, more to herself than to Hassan. "I had no choice." Hassan smiled grimly despite his pain. "There is always a choice, Doctor. Today you chose to become like us, someone who kills to achieve their goals. Your government will call you a hero, but you and I know what you really are now." Sarah wanted to argue, to defend her actions, but the words wouldn't come. Back at the base, Sarah helped rush Williams into emergency surgery, while Hassan was taken to the detention facility for immediate interrogation. Williams survived the operation and would eventually recover fully, another life saved by Sarah's quick thinking and medical skills. Hassan provided intelligence that led to the disruption of 3 planned attacks against coalition forces. By any military standard, the mission had been a complete success. Hassan was captured alive, valuable intelligence was gathered, and the only American casualty was expected to make a full recovery. Sarah received commendations for her performance under fire and was recommended for promotion within the Special Operations medical community. But that night, alone in her room, Sarah sat staring at her hands, the same hands that had saved William's life and taken Omar's. She thought about the photograph of Omar's children and wondered what would happen to them now that their father was dead. She thought about Hassan's words and the uncomfortable truth they contained. For the first time since joining the SEALs, Sarah seriously considered requesting transfer back to a regular medical unit. The transformation from healer to warrior had been so gradual that she hadn't noticed how completely it had changed her. The gentle doctor from Texas who had wanted nothing more than to save lives seemed like a stranger from another lifetime. Over the next few days, Sarah's reputation within the Special Operations community grew even stronger. Word of her actions during the Hassan mission spread quickly, and she began receiving requests to join other elite units for dangerous missions. The SEAL spoke of her with a reverence usually reserved for the most legendary warriors. "Doc, you're one of us now," Morrison told her a week after the mission. "You've proven you can make the hard choices when lives are on the line. That's what separates the real operators from everyone else." Sarah nodded and smiled, but inside she felt empty. 3 months later, Sarah completed her deployment and returned to the United States. She was offered a permanent position with SEAL Team 7 and several other special operations units, opportunities that would have been impossible for a civilian doctor just 2 years earlier. The military wanted to keep her, to continue using her unique combination of medical skills and combat experience. Standing in the airport in Norfolk, Virginia, waiting for her flight home to Texas, Sarah made her decision. She would not re-enlist for another deployment. She would return to civilian medicine, to the world where her job was simply to save lives without having to take them. But as she boarded the plane, Sarah knew that she could never really go back. The experiences in Afghanistan had changed her in ways that could never be undone. She was no longer the idealistic young doctor who had wanted to heal the world, nor was she fully the warrior that the SEALs had trained her to become. She was something new, something that existed in the gray space between healer and fighter, between savior and destroyer. And while the SEALs would indeed never forget what she had done for them, Sarah knew that she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand who she had become in those mountains and deserts so far from home. The plane lifted off into the clear Virginia sky, carrying Sarah back to a world that would seem strange and safe after everything she had experienced. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine returning to the quiet operating rooms of Walter Reed. But all she could see were Omar's children in